War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to this week's episode, Clausewitz, Book 2. Okay, so this one only has 6 chapters, and we're going to go over it. And here, Clausewitz kind of does the examination of the theory of war. It's a good continuation of Book 1. There's a little bit of redundancy, and we'll just kind of jump into it. Now, the first chapter talks about the branches of the art of war, and he spends a lot of time differentiating between the science and art of war. And I think this is part of his Germanic ancestry. I don't want to get all racist on you, but Germans have an earned reputation for being very scientific and very analytical. And I think much of Clausewitz's desire was to take the lessons of Napoleon, and here I'll say the French probably have a reputation for being a little more artistic. And the fact is, the Prussian scientific mechanism of war, certainly Frederick the Great would fall under a more scientific way of going about at least battle, contrasted and failed against the Napoleonic art of war. And I think Clausewitz was wrestling with this. And his emphasis on identifying how war is an art versus a science was much of him battling the culture of both the Prussian army and the German people overall. So there's a lot of that discussion in the second book. He looks at earlier theorists who are trying to develop a science of war. And again, I think there's a lot of attraction to a military writer to gain attention to say that there are fixed rules that if you follow, you will be successful in combat. That'd be nice to have. Wouldn't it be great to just, hey, if you read this book and do what I say, you will never be defeated. That's handy, but it's also false. And Clausewitz, a product of his age and his experience watching his beloved Prussian army getting its butt kicked regularly by Napoleon, thought it his duty to figure out how they can analyze and conduct war in such a manner where they'd be more successful. And a tribute to the Prussian system that this sort of discussion was not only allowed, but it was encouraged by virtue of Clausewitz being appointed to a high role at a fairly young age to lead this effort with their war college. It's important to understand that there are some parts of war that are scientific. It doesn't negate that there are scientific principles within the overall military system. He looks at things like recruitment, organization, training, equipment, logistics, and then contrasts them with actual military operations. So the former are technical, and the latter involve the command decisions. And here's a key point that can never be forgotten: under conditions of uncertainty and danger. And this is where he builds upon his first book. And then we talk a little bit more about tactics and strategy. Tactics concern the employment of armed forces during engagements, while strategy concerns the use of those engagements to achieve the broader objectives of the war. And though interconnected, they require different forms of judgment. And here's the Peter principle, or whatever you want to call it, where because someone is tactically proficient or even very skilled and very successful, it does not mean that their tactical skills are going to translate into the ability to formulate and execute strategy. So again, he lists the engineering and fortification and supply with their specialized bodies of knowledge, and that these fields will be governed by fixed principles, but by themselves do not determine victory. And success in war depends on how these technical capabilities are integrated into strategic decision-making. I started my career off in the Corps of Engineers, and I don't think a branched engineer officer ever has become chief of staff. It used to be you had the 3, I won't say combat arms, but the 3 main branches of the military were infantry, cavalry, and artillery. And then this became infantry and armor, which were known as maneuver. And then you had fires, which was, you had artillery, and then later air defense artillery. And then you had the specialty branches, the Ordnance Bureau, the Corps of Engineers, logistics, things like that. And only the 3 big ones, the infantry, cavalry, and artillery, were considered fit to have the highest ranks. The 4-star ranks were kind of limited to them. Engineers petered out. That's why people like Westmoreland and certainly MacArthur started off as an engineer and became an infantryman when he made colonel. And Westmoreland started off as an aviator in the field artillery branch and then became an infantryman during the Korean War. This acknowledged, I think, an intelligent way of differentiating that some branches are going to develop the skill sets required for the highest commands, and other branches, while requiring a very intelligent, very knowledgeable officer, that someone who immersed themselves in the technical scientific aspect of war could not suddenly, after 30 years of experience, turn that off and become someone adept at the paintbrushes of conflict and becoming that artist of war that you need at the highest levels. I don't know if that's still valid. I don't know if it was ever valid, but I think there is merit to the argument, whether or not it was right or wrong. And because of this discussion, there's no one branch that can dominate military thought. So at times, there was excessive focus on the engineering, logistics, or mathematics, obscuring the fundamental political and human character of warfare. And you also have to consider that Vauban and his engineering fortifications and methods to take down his engineering fortifications dominated thought just previous to the Napoleonic warfare. And, his very scientific construction of fortifications was a dominant theme in military history. So military theory has to be broad enough to incorporate technical expertise and still recognize that command decisions cannot be reduced to technical calculations. So the second chapter goes into military theory. And again, he criticizes the earlier theorists for attempting to create comprehensive systems with fixed rules. These systems fail because war is too dynamic, uncertain, and dependent upon human interaction to be governed by universal formulas. Every campaign represents unique circumstances with geography, politics, morale, leadership, chance, enemy decisions, all these things that we've talked about that would take any set of fixed rules and render them, if not completely worthless, at least insufficient for a predictable chance at victory. And rules that appear successful in one situation may prove disastrous in another. Rather than providing rigid prescriptions, theory should function as a guide. Its purpose is to sharpen the commander's analytical abilities, enabling him to recognize important factors and then make the sound judgments in complex situations while still acknowledging that he could be wrong and that there's no one-size-fits-all. Clausewitz emphasized that theory identifies relationships between military phenomena rather than dictate exact actions. It'll illuminate the patterns without pretending to eliminate uncertainty. He rejected the tendency to separate theory from practice. Good theory emerges from careful study of historical experience, while good practice benefits from theoretical reflection. Neither can replace the other. You can't just go to war and use that as your basis of why you should be in command. And likewise, you can't just study war with never experiencing it and expect that to be a substitute. You both must study and practice war to be a truly successful commander. Again, Clausewitz keeps hitting this point. Don't look for certainty where none can possibly exist. War involves living, thinking enemies who continually adapt. The enemy possesses independent intelligence and will. Then we get into his chapter 3. We talk about the art or science. And again, if anything's become clear, war can never be regarded as a true science because disciplines of science rely upon stable, measurable relationships, the scientific method. Anyone who studied the scientific method or has studied war can realize that there'll never be a science of engaging in warfare. But then again, it's not a pure artistic creativity detached from rational analysis. Military command requires the disciplined thinking grounded in historical experience and practical knowledge. So Clausewitz, when we talk about is war an art or a science, it's both and neither. It's its own thing. It is, in his rough translation, a practical human activity, combining elements of both. And it's easier to compare it to politics and commerce and statecraft, fields where decisions involve uncertainty, competing interests, and always incomplete information.
Success depends upon judgment, not formula. Leadership requires balancing the objective analysis with intuition. Commanders must assess the changing circumstances constantly while anticipating enemy reactions, making decisions despite this incomplete information. So Clausewitz looks at this, and this reflects his overarching philosophy that military knowledge should cultivate practical wisdom rather than any sort of mechanical calculation. Now, chapter 4 is weird because it has one of those German words that don't really translate to English. So it is Methodismus, which sometimes is translated to Methodism or a combination of words, Methodism and routine. And here is Clausewitz really weighing in, and I got to say the Prussian system, but I think all militaries are guilty of this to a certain degree. And that is his criticism of rigid military doctrine. And his word, we'll call it Methodism for this, refers to the excessive reliance upon standardized procedures regardless of circumstances. And here I'm going to go back to Iran and breaking out the Air Force's, if we bomb this, we will be successful playbook. Every enemy has different points of leverage. Their centers of gravity are not always going to be the same. The point of air power, and specifically strategic air power, as opposed to tactical air support, is to attack the center of gravity. And here we see that, I think, rather than analyzing it from a strategic viewpoint and a political viewpoint, we analyze and we execute on an operational playbook, which has become rote. We already know what they're going to bomb. What we're going to bomb, I should say. I have an antagonistic relationship with the Air Force, obviously. And they bomb what they're going to bomb. And I think the enemy works around that. And I've contrasted the American targeting system with the Israeli targeting methodology in Iran. And I come down on the Israeli side with them targeting the leadership versus the infrastructure like the United States does. And I'm not saying the Israelis always do target leadership, but they do seem more focused on that if you look at operations in Lebanon, in Gaza, the West Bank, whereas during their operations in 1973 and 1967 and 56, their targets were far more operational and tactical, more mirroring the United States viewpoint. And I think that's the difference between fighting a army versus a terrorist organization. The centers of gravity are going to be very, very different between the two. I don't think the United States Air Force acknowledges that particularly well, and I think our failures are reflecting our inflexibility and lack of artistic eye in how we utilize our amazing air strike capabilities. So, and this gets bad because methods have practical value. They reduce confusion. They improve efficiency and simple administration. We have battle drills, and I think there was 5, then there's 8. I don't know. These are things that we do instinctually, that we constantly train, that we don't require thinking orders. And the closer you get to the tactical level, the more important these drills become. The discipline, the danger that is experienced at the infantry squad is different than the danger that it's going to be experienced at a brigade or a division level. And the more disciplined and methodic the drill, the less the element of danger and fog and uncertainty will degrade those operations. These methods become dangerous when commanders mistake them for universal laws. The lower level officers and enlisted benefit from standardized methods because their responsibilities involve recurring tasks. But senior commanders confront unique strategic situations requiring independent judgment each and every time they decide upon a course of action. Rigid adherence to doctrine will prevent commanders from adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Each war presents new combinations of political aims, geography, enemy capabilities, and available resources, and inflexible procedures will produce failures. We suffer from this, from conflict to conflict. So ultimately, Clausewitz advocates for a flexible application of methods, not an abandonment of them, but an acknowledgement that what worked before could work again, but may not, and to reevaluate the situation you find yourself in before you blindly copy what you did previously. Habitual methods may emerge naturally through experience, and experienced commanders develop preferred approaches because they have proven successful. and they match both the enemy and the troops. You could look at Frederick the Great with his oblique attack. He did that over and over and over again. It worked, but it was secondary to the discipline of the Prussian forces and Frederick the Great's ability to take his preferred method of attack tactically and his troops and apply them to the proper battlefield. So it wasn't just the oblique attack. It was a number of factors, and he would take his preferred attack method and match them to the circumstances and ensure that his forces were in circumstances where his preferred method of attack would be more successful. Habits become valuable so long as commanders remain willing to modify them when circumstances require. I am not confident that our senior leaders are able to adjust things that they've done for 30 years to change them. And it doesn't appear it's bearing much fruit right now. The chapter distinguishes ultimately between useful professional routines and destructive doctrinal rigidity. All right, chapter 5 is criticism, my favorite chapter, a chapter dedicated to critiquing people. And here, Clausewitz kind of cuts me down a little bit and to explain the proper role of military criticism, which he defines as the analytical examination of military decisions and historical campaigns. The purpose of criticism is not merely to assign praise or blame. We already know it belongs to the Air Force. But it seeks to understand why commanders acted as they did and how their decisions related to the circumstances they faced. Don't judge historical commanders solely by outcomes. Victory does not automatically prove wisdom, and defeat does not necessarily indicate incompetence. Chance frequently influences the military events. Proper criticism requires reconstructing the information available to commanders at the time decisions were made. Analysts have to avoid the hindsight bias. Looking behind you, hindsight is 20/20. Recognize that the commanders acted amid uncertainty. So there's three primary functions of criticism. Investigate historical facts as accurately as possible. Identify the causal relationship between decisions and outcomes. And evaluate the appropriateness of decisions based upon the information reasonably available at the time. Criticism has to remain objective rather than moralistic. Merely condemning mistakes without understanding the context does nothing to forward your military education. History study becomes valuable because it develops judgment. So when you are examining campaigns, you'll eventually start seeing these constant military problems occurring and reoccurring. And different commanders will come up with different solutions at different times, all of which may have succeeded at one time, failed at another time, in the diversity of possible solutions. And Clausewitz sees military history as the primary laboratory for developing strategic understanding. And here I will go back to critiquing at least how the Army trains its officer corps. We do not use military history as the primary laboratory for developing strategic understanding. We use political science. We use postmodernistic historical analysis of political events, but ignore military history. And then we also delve into doctrinal discussions without really having any deep dive into the military events which shaped our doctrine. We don't do a good job of developing strategic leadership in our General Officer Corps across the branches that I can see, and our results are reflecting that. You can say what you will, but we're not seeing the great thinkers emerge. So the final chapter 6, is on the importance of these historical examples. So Clausewitz, again, strongly supports the study of military history, but he warns against superficial imitation. Historical examples provide concrete illustrations of military principles. Abstract theory alone fails to convey the complexity of real command decisions. But by studying actual campaigns, officers and students observe how political objectives, geography, morale, logistics, leadership, and chance all interact. Clausewitz also wisely says don't treat famous campaigns as templates for future wars. Every historical event reflects unique conditions that will never be perfectly reproduced. Historical examples rather stimulate critical thinking. Officers should ask why particular decisions succeeded or failed, what alternatives existed, and how changing circumstances might have altered the outcome. Clausewitz notes that recent history provides especially valuable lessons because military institutions, technology, and political conditions most closely resemble those of contemporary commanders. On this note, far before I ever studied Clausewitz, I did try to do a deep dive in a few different conflicts, which my intuition reflected what Clausewitz instructed. I focused on the Arab-Israeli wars, the Falklands Campaign, and the Rhodesian Civil War. I chose these because they were modern, and they provided the best examples that I could find of unique military circumstances, many of them at a peer-to-peer level, but using tanks and jet aircraft and nuclear-powered submarines and helicopters and things of that nature. So I recommend to anyone to find some campaigns and wars that fascinate you and study them deeply. But for a military professional, choose those conflicts that are closer in history. A lot of people love the Civil War, and I never really got into it. You could look at World War II and whatnot, but the farther you go back in history, the harder it is to really glean practical lessons learned, especially at the tactical and operational level, and even the strategic level. The politics, you could argue, remain constant in that you use war as a means to achieve your political objectives, and that is a universality you'll find, dating back as far back as you want to go. But for good historical examples to study to prepare you for future battlefields, the closer they are historically, the better it is for you. When studying military history, examples involving great commanders deserve particular attention because exceptional leaders demonstrate military judgment under difficult circumstances. But these require careful analysis rather than hero worship. You can study Napoleon all you want to. You're not Napoleon. I'm not Napoleon. And it would be unwise to look at the great examples of these commanders and try to emulate what they did without realizing some of these guys were just military geniuses, and you cannot rely or even biasly think that you possess the same level of genius as these guys do. Just learn your lessons. And finally, the chapter ends by reaffirming the educational purpose of historical study. The objective is not memorization, but intellectual development. And these historical examples enrich any future commander's understanding, strengthens their judgment, and broadens their strategic imagination. The more you learn of military history, the broader your palette becomes when you paint this art of war. That's book 2. A lot of lessons there. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.